This podcast is presented to you by HM Equity Research. The following content is provided for informational purposes only and does not constitute financial advice. Always consult with a certified financial advisor before making any investment decisions. If you found this helpful, don't forget to click the subscribe button and show your support by following us and sharing it with others who could benefit. Your encouragement keeps us motivated to create more content like this.
Ready to explore Argentina's economy? Buckle up, because it's a wild ride of boom and bust cycles and the long shadow of populism.
Yeah, it really is.
We'll be using excerpts from a great source today, The Argentine Downfall, to really get into the details.
That'll good.
And this deep dive isn't just about history. I think understanding Argentina's path can teach us about development in general.
Oh, for sure.
The allure and dangers of populism, and how policy choices, they have ripple effects that last generations.
Absolutely.
Now, what I find so fascinating is how Argentina had so much going for it, but got stuck in this cycle of crisis.
It really is a paradox. Like you said, they had everything, right?
Fertile land, tons of mineral wealth, a strategic location for trade.
Totally. In the early 20th century, Argentina was like a magnet for European immigrants. I mean, their per capita income was up there with the wealthiest nations.
Wow. So what happened?
Well, the Argentine downfall really puts it well. It says their journey took a sharp turn, going from barbarism to decadence after only briefly glimpsing civilization.
Whoa. That's a pretty strong statement.
Yeah, it is.
So what factors contributed to this dramatic shift?
Well, the Great Depression, it was definitely a major turning point. And it wasn't just the global economic downturn. You see, Argentina's terms of trade, meaning the ratio of export prices to import prices, completely plummeted.
So their ability to make money from exports took a big hit.
Exactly, a big hit. This decline really hammered their ability to generate income from exports.
So basically, this economic vulnerability kind of opened the door for a new political force to step in.
You could say that, yeah. The rise of populism, particularly under Juan Perón.
Right, Perón, famous for?
Oh, he promised economic justice for the working class. He nationalized industries, expanded social welfare programs.
Those policies were very popular at the time, right?
Super popular. I mean, Perón's policies resonated with a population that was struggling. Remember, this is right after the Depression.
People were looking for answers.
Exactly, and they saw immediate improvements in their living standards. But, the Argentine downfall makes a really interesting argument.
What's that?
They say this approach had serious long-term consequences that weren't really considered.
Interesting. What were some of those unintended consequences?
Well, the government was spending a lot more, but it wasn't bringing in more revenue to match it. So, classic problem inflation.
Makes sense.
And that eroded a lot of the initial economic gains that Perón had made. And as inflation went up, what happened?
What?
Social unrest.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, creating a real breeding ground for instability.
So it sounds like Perón's policies created a vicious cycle almost.
That's a great way to put it. His intentions might have been good, but that focus on short-term gains and redistribution of wealth, it ultimately contributed to more economic instability. And this pattern we see prioritizing immediate benefits over long-term stability.
Right.
Well, it would pop up again and again in Argentina's history.
It's fascinating how certain economic patterns like this can repeat themselves.
It really is.
Even across different time periods and with different leaders in charge.
Yeah, it really speaks to the deep-rooted structural issues that were present within the Argentine economy at the time.
So Perón was eventually ousted in a military coup in 1955, right?
That's right.
Did this end the economic troubles? I mean, did a new regime come in and fix things?
Unfortunately, not really. Military interventions, they became like a recurring theme.
Oh, wow.
Throughout the 20th century in Argentina.
Yeah.
These periods of military rule, you know what they often did?
I'm guessing they didn't help.
Exacerbated existing economic problems.
Yeah.
It just led to more instability and uncertainty.
It seems like Argentina was trapped in this back and forth struggle.
Yeah.
Between populism and then military intervention, both of which ended up hurting the economy.
It's true. It's a great observation. These two forces, even though they seem opposed on the surface, they kind of fed off each other in a way, contributing to the cyclical nature of Argentina's economic woes.
And then on top of all this, were there specific events that made things even worse?
Definitely. The Falklands War in 1982, that really stands out.
Right, the conflict with the UK over the Falkland Islands.
Exactly. Now, that war was a disaster for Argentina both militarily and economically. I mean, it just drained resources.
It had to.
Fueled even more inflation.
Wow.
And ultimately led to the collapse of the military junta.
So even after Perón was gone and the military regime was gone, Argentina's economic troubles just kept going.
Oh, they did. In fact, they intensified in the late 1980s. We're talking hyperinflation here. Prices were increasing at astronomical rates.
Wow, just out of control.
Completely.
What was daily life like for people during that time? I mean, can you even imagine?
Imagine going to the store in the morning, and by the time you come back in the afternoon, the price of bread has increased tenfold. I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah, it's insane.
This economic instability wiped out people's savings, made it incredibly difficult for families to put food on the table just to get by.
I can only imagine how demoralizing that must have been.
It really was. This kind of economic trauma, it shapes the way people view their government.
Of course.
And the economy, even today, right?
Yeah.
And it also really highlights how crucial it is to have sound economic policies for societal stability.
No doubt about it. So, facing this hyperinflation, what did Argentina do? Did they find a way to tame it?
They went for a very drastic measure in the early 1990s. It was called the convertibility plan.
Okay.
They pegged the Argentine peso to the U.S. dollar at a fixed 1-to-1 exchange rate.
Wow, that's a bold move.
It was a gamble,
Yeah.
a radical attempt to regain control and curb the runaway inflation.
So, in essence, they tied their currency to the U.S. dollar, hoping to, I guess, import some stability.
That was the idea.
What was the initial impact?
Well, at first, the convertibility plan, it seemed like it was working. Like inflation plummeted.
Wow.
And there was a huge surge of foreign investment.
People were feeling good about it.
It felt like Argentina had finally turned a corner.
It sounds like a solution, at least for a while. But I have a feeling there's more to this story, right?
You're right, there is. The convertibility plan, while initially successful, had some serious drawbacks that would eventually lead to yet another crisis.
And that brings us to the edge of another chapter in this economic saga.
Yeah, the convertibility plan, it was a bold move.
Yeah.
Almost like a last-ditch effort to break free from that hyperinflation, you know?
Yeah.
You really have to understand how desperate this situation was to get why they would try something like that.
It's hard to fathom an entire country dealing with hyperinflation like that.
Oh, absolutely.
So this recovery, though, it seemed almost miraculous, right?
Yeah.
But what were the hidden costs, the things people maybe weren't seeing at the time?
Well, think of it like this.
Okay.
Imagine a ship setting sail, but its rudder is fixed in place.
Okay.
Can't change course no matter what. That's what Argentina did with this convertibility plan.
So they were stuck.
By fixing their currency to the U.S. dollar, they basically gave up control over their own monetary policy.
Oh, I see.
They couldn't adapt if the economic winds changed.
And they did change, right?
Oh, they did. The storms came, yeah.
Yeah.
You had the Mexican peso crisis in 1994 and then the Brazilian currency devaluation in 1999.
Right.
These sent shockwaves through the global economy and really exposed the flaws in Argentina's system.
So how did those external crises directly impact Argentina?
With the peso fixed, they couldn't adjust. Their exports became more expensive, so less competitive on the world market.
Less attractive to buyers.
Right. At the same time, imports became cheaper,
Oh,
letting the market.
so they're being squeezed from both sides.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this pressure led to a growing trade deficit, which put enormous strain on their economy. The government, they tried to keep the convertibility plan going by accumulating more and more debt, but it was like trying to plug a leak with a Band-Aid.
It just wasn't going to work long term.
Yeah.
So was there anything Argentina could have done differently? I mean, with that convertibility plan in place, was there any way to get through these challenges?
It's hard to say for sure. Some economists argue that, Argentina needed more flexibility
Okay.
in its exchange rate to be able to adapt.
Right.
But others think the convertibility plan itself is just inherently flawed.
A fundamental problem.
That was always going to lead to a future crisis no matter what.
A ticking time bomb, almost.
Yeah, that's one way to put it.
But whatever the answer is, ultimately, that system couldn't hold.
No, it couldn't. And in 2001, the dam finally broke. Argentina experienced a complete economic meltdown.
Wow.
The Argentine downfall calls it the Great Depression of Argentina.
Do a full-blown crisis.
Oh, yeah. Banks shut down, people couldn't access their savings, unemployment skyrocketed, and protests erupted all across the country.
Chaos.
It was a period of immense hardship, just pure uncertainty.
I remember reading about the Corralito. What exactly was that?
Oh, the Corralito, literally meaning little corral.
Yeah.
It was a really desperate attempt by the government to prevent the banking system from totally collapsing.
Okay.
They restricted people's access to their own accounts. Like, you could only withdraw something like $250 per week.
Wow.
Imagine that.
That's nothing.
Yeah.
So how did people react to these restrictions?
They were furious, as you can imagine, and rightfully so. They felt betrayed by this system that had promised stability, but instead delivered chaos. And the cacerolazos, you probably heard of those.
Oh, yeah.
The pot-banging protests, right?
Yeah.
They became this symbol of anger and frustration.
Yeah.
People were in the streets demanding change, accountability, just a way out of this economic nightmare.
It's a powerful image to think about. All these people banging pots and pans, their voices echoing through the city streets.
It really is.
Did those protests have an impact, though? Did they change anything?
Oh, they definitely added to the pressure on the government.
Yeah.
And amid all this chaos, President Fernando de la Rua resigned, fled the presidential palace by helicopter.
Wow. What a dramatic exit.
It was a turning point,
Yeah.
But not necessarily a positive one.
Yeah.
Argentina was left to deal with the aftermath of this collapse.
Yeah.
I mean, they had a devalued currency, soaring inflation, and this mountain of debt they couldn't possibly repay.
And that default on their sovereign debt was a big one, wasn't it?
Oh, it was a record-breaking event, the largest sovereign debt default in history at that time.
Wow.
A staggering $132 billion. It sent shockwaves through the entire global financial system.
I bet it did.
Damaged Argentina's international standing even further.
So at that point, it felt like Argentina had really hit rock bottom.
Yeah.
What happened next? Did they kind of just fade from the global economic stage?
Surprisingly, no. Argentina did eventually start to recover, but it was a really long and difficult journey.
And I'm assuming that recovery, just like those crises that came before it, is full of complexities and nuances.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's no simple explanation for how they managed to climb back from that abyss. It's a mix of internal and external factors, policy choices, and, maybe even a bit of luck.
We've seen Argentina go through this devastating economic collapse. I mean, it's a story that would make any economist cringe.
It's rough.
But you mentioned they did recover.
Yeah.
How did they manage to pull themselves out of such a deep hole?
Well, it's complicated, but one key factor was the devaluation of the peso after the 2001 crisis. Now, while it was painful initially, it actually made their exports way cheaper on the global market, which really boosted their competitiveness.
So a silver lining to that dark cloud, I guess.
You could say that. It helped reset things. And then they had another stroke of luck.
What was that?
A global commodities boom took off, driven by China's huge demand for raw material.
Yeah, and Argentina, with all its agricultural resources, they were in a prime position to benefit.
Exactly. Exports of soybeans, wheat, and other agricultural products, they just surged, bringing in that much-needed foreign currency. But it wasn't all just luck, though.
Right, because policy always plays a role.
Oh, absolutely. Nestor Kirchner, who became president in 2003, along with his economy minister, Roberto Lavagna, they implemented a mix of policies that really focused on this idea of import substitution.
Okay. Import substitution, meaning?
The goal was to encourage domestic production and reduce their reliance on imports.
I see.
So basically, they were trying to become more self-sufficient.
Got it. Can you give us an example of how that worked in practice?
Yeah, so they would provide subsidies and tax breaks to domestic industries, making it more attractive for Argentine companies to produce the goods they had been importing previously.
So it incentivized local production.
Exactly. And this really helped to stimulate economic activity within the country.
So instead of relying on others, they were focusing on building up their own industries.
Right, exactly. And they also made big investments in social welfare programs to try to address the poverty and inequality that had been made worse by the crisis.
So it was a balancing act, trying to stimulate growth, but also protects the most vulnerable citizens.
Exactly. It was a tough situation.
But it sounds like this recovery, it was heavily dependent on that global commodities boom, right?
It was.
So what happens when those external factors change? Because they always do, eventually.
That's a great question. While the Kirchner and Lavagna era saw some really impressive GDP growth,
Like how much?
exceeding 8% annually for several years.
Wow, that's huge.
It is, but it did raise concerns about sustainability.
Meaning it wasn't built on a solid foundation, perhaps?
Yeah, some people felt that way, that they were just kind of papering over the cracks.
Right.
The underlying structural problems, the high inflation, the commodity dependence, the weak institutions, all of those things persisted.
They never really went away.
No. And they would resurface again in 2018, contributing to yet another crisis.
So what triggered this new downturn? I mean, was it purely internal factors this time?
It was a combination of things, actually. Mauricio Macri, who came to power in 2015, he had promised all these market-oriented reforms.
Okay.
But he faced a really tough situation. Inflation was already high, the currency was getting weaker, and a drought hit agricultural production hard.
So both internal problems and external factors ganging up at the same time.
Exactly, a perfect storm.
That's tough.
It was. And so Macri's government, they were looking for relief, and they turned to the International Monetary Fund for a bailout.
IMF, that's never a good sign.
No, and it was their largest bailout ever, too.
And we know those bailouts often come with strings attached.
Oh, absolutely. The IMF loan did give some short-term relief, but it came with all these strict austerity measures.
Right.
And unfortunately, those measures just deepened the recession and fueled even more social unrest.
So needing help, but the help itself causing more pain.
Yeah, it's a classic dilemma, isn't it?
Did this open the door for, another shift in political and economic direction for Argentina?
It did. In 2019, the Peronists, under Alberto Fernandez, they returned to power. And they reintroduced some familiar policies, currency controls, subsidies, price controls.
Back to a more interventionist approach.
Exactly. Now, the goal of these measures was to try to protect those domestic industries and control inflation. But they also sparked concerns, about economic distortions and long-term sustainability.
It sounds like Argentina is stuck in this constant back and forth between different economic approaches.
It's a tough cycle to break.
So where does this leave them today? I mean, after all these twists and turns, where is Argentina now?
As of right now, they're still dealing with high inflation, debt, and just the lingering effects of multiple economic crises.
It's a lot to overcome.
It is. It's a really sobering reminder that there are no quick fixes to these complex challenges.
So true. Well, Argentina's journey has been a wild one. I mean, talk about a roller coaster ride full of ups and downs, twists and turns. What are the key takeaways from all this? What can we learn from their experiences?
Well, I think Argentina's story really highlights just how fragile economic systems can be.
Yeah.
It shows how important it is to have sound policies in place,
right,
strong institutions, and to diversify your economy to handle those external shocks.
Be prepared for anything, basically.
Exactly. But it also reveals the human cost of economic turmoil, the impact it has on people's lives.
Absolutely.
Their livelihoods, their hopes for the future. It's a really important reminder.
It is. As we wrap up this deep dive, it's clear that Argentina's economic story is far from over.
Not even close.
They're still searching for that path to sustainable growth and stability, but it's a tough road ahead.
It really is. It raises a lot of questions, Can they break free from this cycle of booms and busts? Can they find a sustainable path to prosperity? And these aren't just questions for Argentina.
Right. It applies to everyone.
Exactly. For any country dealing with similar economic challenges, understanding their journey, it offers valuable lessons for all of us, really.
Well, thank you so much for taking us on this fascinating journey through Argentina's economic history. It's been a really insightful deep dive.
You're welcome. I encourage everyone to keep exploring this topic and really think about what Argentina's experience means for the global economy as a whole, because the story's far from finished.
Who knows what the next chapter will hold?
Exactly.